here today. Let's keep this awesome atmosphere of worship and continue to press in to the Lord today, to what it is that he wants to speak to us, speak to you. In case you didn't figure it out, we do not have Pastor Scott here today, and Pastor Tiffany either, hence me here. They made the mistake of giving me a mic, and I'm just going to talk forever, apparently. Just kidding. No. Pastor Tiffany is over helping with kids today, and we have a guest speaker that's not really a guest. He is awesome, Michael. I'm sure you all know him, or somewhat at least. Man, he's got a great word for you today. Yeah, get ready to receive it. All right, Michael.
Thanks, Sean. Offer still stands. You can preach second service. Have you ever met someone who turned out to be completely different than you thought they would be? You know, maybe it was your teacher, maybe it was your kid's teacher, or a neighbor, or a roommate, or just someone that you interacted with. You know, you thought they'd be one way, and when you got to meet them, it turned out they were totally different than you expected. You have the person in mind? No? I'll wait. No. Think about that person. Think about the interaction, okay? That's happened to me a number of times. And the most interesting time happened a couple years ago. I was in Washington, D.C., and I was with some friends, and we're kind of walking around the Capitol, and it was around sundown, and we see all these lights in this park in front of the Capitol building. You know, they weren't like park lights. They were like, you know, temporary lights set up, and we knew something was going on. I was like, okay, well, we should go check this out. So we walked over, and as we got close, we realized that Anderson Cooper for CNN was interviewing Senator John McCain. I'm like, what? This is happening like right here. So we just sat there and just waited for them to finish the interview, and then they finished it, turned the cameras off. So we went up there, shook their hands. You know, they both sat and talked with us for a little bit. Senator McCain had to go, but, you know, talked to him just a brief couple minutes and shook his hand. But Anderson Cooper works at CNN, has his own TV show at CNN, AC360, and he just sat there and just talked to us for like 30 minutes. And being that he's on CNN and all this stuff, and he's really famous, and all these people know him, like we expected him to be, at least I expected him to be, you know, just full of himself. You know, he's can't believe that we peasants would come talk to him. But he wasn't like that at all. He was super nice. In fact, you know, he took pictures with us and just talked with us. And side note, I posted a picture of me and him on Facebook. Actually, I reshared it. Posted it a couple years ago. But reshared it this week in case you're interested to go see me and Anderson Cooper, BFFs. But we talked for like 30 minutes, and he was just so kind. Like, people were coming up to him, and he wasn't refusing pictures from anybody, just talking, very, very humble. You know, people were coming up to him, just fumbling over their camera and dropping it, picking it up. You know, a bunch of people actually did that. I got kind of annoyed. I got annoyed for him. Like, people are wasting his time, but he didn't show any sign of that. Like, he was there as if he had nothing better to do, almost as if we were the famous ones, just random people coming up to him, and that he was the one who was honored by us. And that's not something I ever would have expected for Anderson Cooper. He broke my expectation. And sometimes I think we treat God like that. You know, because of the Christian heritage in our country, because of maybe we grew up in a Christian family, we grew up in different family, values of God, we sometimes expect God to be a certain way. We kind of maybe build a mold for God, and sometimes he breaks out of that mold because you can't cage the God of the universe in our own finite expectations. And what God keeps teaching me over and over again is that who he is much bigger, much deeper, and much stronger than I often imagine. In the book, The Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis makes the statement that Aslan is not exactly a tame lion. You know, he comes and goes as he pleases, does what he wants, is on his own timeline. And in case you don't know, it's a spoiler alert, Aslan represents Jesus. Shocker, right? But the Lion of Judah, Jesus, is not a tame lion. We can't put him in a zoo. We can't confine him to our own expectations of who he is. He is much bigger, much deeper, and much stronger, much truly, in all his reality, who he is. It's much deeper than what we imagine. And I think the same is true of the love of God. You know, we sing about it, and we have a lot of great songs about the love of God. But for me personally, I often kind of brush past the idea of the love of God. You know, for me, like, it's like something over there. Like, yeah, it's here, and we see, you know, these Christmas trees, and yeah, they're here, but they're not really center stage. Often in my life, the love of God kind of plays that role. And I want to move on to the deeper things. And what God keeps reminding me is that the love of God is bigger and deeper and stronger than I often imagine. There's a story about the Apostle John when he was an old man. You know, Jesus had the 12 apostles, and, you know, Judas hanged himself. 10 of them were brutally executed by the government, by different governments where they went. And the Romans kept trying to kill John. They just couldn't kill him. He just wouldn't die. So finally they put him like on a prison, on an island, and he lived to be a very old age. And people got to visit him, and often young men would come up and visit him, like, hey, tell us about Jesus now that you're like 90 years old and Jesus died like 50 years before we were born. We want to hear about Jesus. And John would always say the same thing. He would say, he told us to love each other. And the young men were like, yeah, but like, tell us about this, tell us about that. And John would always reorient the conversation to, he told us to love each other. And I think, you know, if I were there, I would totally be one of these young men. You know, like, hey, tell us about, you know, how God is completely sovereign and how we have free will. Tell us how to interpret the end times. Why don't you tell us about those miracles that, you know, didn't make it into the Bible? I want to hear about those. And I could just imagine the Apostle John just looking at me and shaking his head. He's like, Michael, you don't get it. And if you've read his writings in the New Testament, you may understand that. You know, in his own gospel, he never calls himself out by name. He always refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that wasn't a prideful thing. It's not like he loves me as opposed to you other 11 schmoes. You know, it wasn't a prideful thing. It's that he got his entire identity in the love of God. He was totally transformed by the love of God to the extent that that's who he was. That's his very identity. That's how he thought. And so when you read the gospel, when you read 1 John and 2 John, you see the position he has and how he holds the love of God in his life, how much has transformed it. He sees that it's big. He sees that it's strong. He sees that it's not just something in the corner. John saw the love of God, experienced the love of God to such an extent that it changed his very identity and changed the way he referred to himself. He was transformed. And that's because the love of God is not just some nice feeling we have. It's not just God's warm fuzzies toward us. Sometimes we think of love in that way, but God's love is very different from just that. God's love is an active force. God's love moves people to action. Paul said that Christ's love compels us because we're convinced by it. His love compelled Paul to action. The love of God inside of Jesus when he was on earth compelled him to action. There are time and time again, you read in the Gospels, if you read closely, it says, Jesus was moved by compassion, so he performed this miracle. Jesus was moved by compassion, so he fed the 5,000. He moved by compassion because they're like sheep without a shepherd. And because of his love, he moved. Sean even said it this morning. Out of God's love comes God's grace. Out of God's love comes his power. His love is an active force. And I was reminded of that a couple of weeks ago. I was at work. I'm a software developer, work in a downtown Grapevine, and I had a really annoying interaction with this one middle manager. And she's just an obnoxious person and very abrasive, and I had a tough interaction. And it was like, felt like I kind of got run over, you know, in this meeting. She's really gossipy and manipulative, and it's like, so the next morning, I don't even want to go to work at this point. I'm like, oh, really? And I just kind of happened to get up early that morning, and so I thought, well, if I feel this way, I should probably pray about it. So I started praying, and I asked God a question, what do you think about this? And what I hoped his answer would be is that he would take care of it, you know, take care of, in the mafia sense, like I will take care of her. That's what I was hoping he'd say, but he didn't say that. Much to, well, probably better he didn't say that, despite what I wanted. But what he did said, he spoke loud and clear. He said, well, I say loud. He spoke to me, he didn't speak audibly. He spoke to my spirit. And he said, you need to let my love be your confidence. Let my love be your confidence. And if you think about how does the love of God be your confidence? It's because it's an active force. He wanted me to put my confidence in the fact that he's going to move on my behalf. This active force is going to move on my behalf as I cast this care on him. That's what gives me confidence. Not that, well, God likes me and all, but I still have this problem. The confidence comes from the fact that God loves me and he's going to move on my behalf behind the scenes, and I may not even see it, but I can trust that he will because his love is an active force. One of my favorite passages about the love of God comes from a prayer that Paul prayed in Ephesians. And it's really cool to look at the prayers in the Bible because it helps us pray in a more mature way. But that's a different sermon. I'm not going to talk about that. But we are going to talk about this prayer. And in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 14 through 21, in the Christian Standard Bible, Paul writes, "For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named. I pray that he may grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power in your inner being through his Spirit, and that Christ would dwell in your hearts through faith. I pray that you, being rooted and firmly established in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the length and width and height and depth of God's love, and to know Christ's love that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God." The fullness of God. "Now to him who is able to do above and beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen." In this prayer, Paul has 4 basic prayer requests. He prays that the Ephesians would be powerfully strengthened in their spirits. He prays that Christ would come and dwell in their hearts through faith. He prays that they would comprehend the magnitude of God's love. And he prays for them to truly know and experience God's love. And if you look closely, the first 2 requests, they kind of both talk about both God and the Ephesians. But the first 2 requests are primarily about what God would do. And the second 2 requests were primarily what the Ephesians would do. And I don't want to discount Paul's first 2 requests. It's an amazing thing when Paul powerfully strengthens us spiritually. It's a very necessary thing for us to allow Christ to dwell in our hearts by faith. But I want to focus on this theme of God's love. And this is what he wanted. This is what he prayed that the Ephesians would do. And in verse 17 is where he starts it out. He says, "I pray that you, being rooted and firmly established in love." You think the idea of rooted, what does that mean? What do you think of? Probably, if you're like me, you think of a tree, right? Trees are rooted down in the soil, and their roots go deep. In fact, many kinds of trees, if you're to look at like a picture of like the tree above soil and below soil, a lot of times the roots are just as deep as the tree is high. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but it depends on the kind of tree. But the roots grow deep. And what do the roots do? Well, one, they give nutrients to the tree, but they keep it firm and established. If you've ever tried to like pull out a stump with a truck, you may have broken your truck because those things are in there firmly established. You know what firmly established means if you try to pull that out. I can't tell you how many bumpers have been ripped off of trucks because of just trying to do that. And what does Paul want the Ephesians, what does he want us to be rooted in? In God's love. And not just the warm fuzzies, but in the active force. He wants us to be rooted and confident in the love of God. In verse 18, Paul continues, he prays, he wants them to be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the length and width, height and depth of God's love. Think of length and width and height and depth. It's a 3-dimensional thing. His love is not just a pretty picture on the wall. His love is more like a structure. And one of the things that, if you read in the original, and you look at it, you'll kind of miss in translation is that the point of these dimensions is that it's describing something that's huge. It's massive. You know, the thought that's carried in Paul's life, like what he's trying to carry in this prayer, is that it's not just like a box. It's like a mountain. That you may know the massive height of God's love like a mountain, the width and how long it stretches. It's this giant mountain. In fact, the language he uses reminds me of the same language that's used to describe this object in Jerusalem. Now, Paul grew up kind of, it was in modern-day Turkey, but when he was a teenager, he went to Jerusalem to go study because, you know, he was a good Jewish man, good Jewish teenager. And he studied in Jerusalem, so he probably saw this object many, many, many times. King Solomon built this thing in about 960 BC. So about 1,000 years before Paul was born, this thing was built, and it was still there 1,000 years later. In fact, now that we're 3,000 years later, this object is still in Jerusalem. You can go see it today. You probably heard what it's called. It's called the Temple Mount. And the temple that Solomon built about 3,000 years ago was on top of this mountain. And you think of mountains, you know, they're kind of like, you know, not a lot of space on top. So Solomon and his workers took a bunch of concrete and rocks and kind of flattened off the top of the mountain, about 37 acres. So it's this huge, huge foundation made of concrete and rock, massive at the very top, just huge, huge, 37 acres. And on that foundation, he built the temple. And it's lasted through earthquakes. You know, his temple was burnt down by the Babylonians, but they built another temple, and that one was burnt down by the Romans. And now different Muslim groups have built up the Dome of the Rock on there. And this firm foundation of the Temple Mount has stayed for 3,000 years. It's an awesome foundation. And I kind of wonder, based on Paul's language, if he had in mind the thought that just like the Temple Mount, this massive structure on which they built the temple, if God's love is like that Temple Mount, we think of it as a small thing, but it's this huge, huge thing. How he wants us to think that it's massively wide and high and deep. And I wonder if the temple of the Holy Spirit is us. If our foundation should be the love of God. I wonder if that's what he's trying to say. That, you know, we think of the love of God, and at least in my mind, it's like, okay, it's a great song. Let's keep moving. But to really think about it, it is a firm foundation, like a tree is rooted in the ground. God's love will root us, will keep us firm through the storms of life. When you feel like your life is being shaken, like there's an earthquake, or there's a tornado, or there's a hurricane, and all these things, it seems like your life is falling apart. God's love never will. God's love will endure. God's love will last. And it's something that's not just a small thing. We can build our lives upon it. And Paul continues in his prayer. He says, and he prays that the Ephesians would know Christ's love that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Take a second and think about that. To be filled with the fullness of God. Filled up. A fullness of God. It's not just part of God. It's not just one aspect of God. The fullness of who he is, of who he reveals himself to be to us. We don't get that by reading the Bible a lot, even though the Bible will point you to God's love. We don't get that by going to miracle services or by thinking about the miracles in the book of Acts. Those are amazing things. They're wonderful things, and they're great, and it's an awesome manifestation of who God is. But ultimately, those alone don't point us to the fullness of who God is. It comes from his love. And that's what John was talking about when all those young men would come to him, and make-believe Michael goes back in time and talks to him. That's what he's talking about. How the love of God totally transforms. And, you know, there's a difference between knowing someone and knowing about someone. You know, I know Pastor Scott. He's great. I know about Governor Abbott. You know, I've never met the Texas governor. Seems like a nice guy. But I know things about him. But I don't know him. And Paul's saying that when we know, when we experience, like we know a person, that's when we really start to be filled with the fullness of God, is when we know his love. When we experience his love, not just as a warm fuzzy, but when we see that he works on our behalf, and he will move, and he will pursue us, and he'll draw us, and there's never anything that we will do that will make us stop loving him, make him stop loving us. That's where the firm foundation comes in. So what does that mean for us practically? You know, I'm just amazed by the words he spoke to me a couple of weeks ago. He said, "Let my love be your confidence." And that's not just something for me. That's something that all of us can have. God's love can be our confidence. We can be confident in him no matter what comes. Jesus said, "In this world, you will face trouble. But take heart," he says, "I have overcome the world." You know, it's a guarantee. It's not just, something that might happen. Jesus himself guaranteed we will face trouble. We will face storms. Bad things will happen. We will have terrible days. Awful things will happen. But we could take heart. We could take heart. We could be anchored, rooted, and established in who he is. Because when the troubles come like a hurricane, we won't be blown off course. We'll be firmly rooted in the firm foundation of his love. We can be confident in that no matter what happens, he will make a way. Secondly, we can work from having a place of worth rather than trying to work to gain worth. What does that mean? It means that there's a difference between trying to work and prove yourself to people and prove yourself in a job. There's a big difference between proving yourself and just resting assured that I've already been proven. I don't need to impress anybody. I just come in here and do my job. There's a big difference. You see, we all want to be valued. We all want to have worth. And I think we're wired to try to gain that worth from people or from our accomplishments or from our work. We're just naturally hardwired to gain our worth that way. But those are really good things. They're terrible things for worth. I was talking to my youngest sister yesterday, and she was talking about how a girl that she knows over in Lubbock is doing weird, like texting her boyfriend from all these different numbers because she's trying to confuse him. And her hope was that somehow he'd get really confused and then get back with her in a relationship. I'm thinking, what in the world? That's never going to work. That's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. And having these things in my mind, I thought, I wonder if she's trying to gain worth from a relationship with that guy. And spoiler alert, it didn't work, But if we try to gain our worth from a dating relationship, well, it'll work for a little while. You'll feel really good. But as things get rocky or if you break up, your sense of worth, your sense of value and who you are as a person will just plummet. Until you go get another one, until maybe it'll be devalued so many times that you'll do these crazy schemes just to try to keep raising your sense of worth. Or if you try to gain your worth from your accomplishments in work and you work really hard and you have this great position, well, yeah, that'll work for a while, but you get a new boss or the economy does a downturn or maybe you get laid off or all these things happen. If you lose that, your sense of worth will plummet. Dating relationships, work, accomplishments, they're great things, but they're terrible for your worth. What about for your kids? A lot of people get a lot of worth from how good their kids are. And something horrible happens when they turn 13 and they start to rebel. And they start doing crazy things. And parents, in the first service, I saw a couple of parents slapping kids and like, hey, he's talking about you. And so let's not do that. But if you get your worth from how good you think your kids are, when they do rebel, because they're not perfect and they're going to rebel, they're going to try to find their own way. When it happens, your worth as a parent will plummet. Because good parenting is a gift from God, but it's a terrible place to put your worth. Where our worth should be is in the love of God and who he says we are and what he says about us. Because you know what? That's not ever going to change. That's always going to remain the same. You could lose your job. You could break up, your kids could rebel, all sorts of other horrible things could happen in your life, but that will never change. It'll be a firm foundation. The Temple Mount was stood firmly for 3,000 years, and the way it's going, it can stand for another 3,000 years. It's a firm foundation for the temple, and God's love is a firm foundation for this temple, the temple of the Holy Spirit that Paul says we are. That's where our worth should come from. That's where our sense of worth should be. Genesis chapter 1 talks about the creation of the heavens and the earth. And in Genesis 1, it happened in 7 days. And what you see is that, God does some stuff. He does his duty of creation for that day. And every day ends the same way. And Moses, who probably wrote Genesis, writes, It was evening and it was morning the first day. Evening and morning, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day. And maybe you've seen this, maybe you've never seen this. If you've never seen this, your mind's about to be blown, at least mine was. Notice, look closely at that statement. It was evening and it was morning the first day. We don't talk like that. We would say it's morning, then it's evening. For us, morning comes first. Who puts the evening first, right? That just seems silly to us. And it's so silly. I never even noticed that until I was in seminary before I realized that. It was evening, then morning the first day. And you gotta wonder, well, why do they do that? Who would ever think that way? Well, that's the way the Jewish understanding of a day. In ancient Israel and in observing communities today, the day starts around 6 p.m. at sundown. And the very first thing you do in the day, in our day we get up, or we're still up at midnight, drinking coffee or whatever. For them, the first thing you do is you eat a meal. It's like, hey, I get done with that, Hey, you eat dinner as the first part of your day. It sounds great. Then you take an 8-hour nap. Well, that sounds really good. Then you do your work. And it's kind of a simple thing, and it sounds like, just poetic, just almost like poetic nonsense, but it's a real thing. In the Jewish mindset, they're working from rest. And for us, often we're resting from work. We have a long and stressful and just an obnoxious day, can't wait to go to sleep and just conk out and get up and do it again. Thank God it's Friday, oh God it's Monday. But in the Jewish mindset, they start with a meal, then they rest, and then they work from that. That's a very beautiful picture of work and a rest in God. And I think it's the same for us. I think it's the same when we think about working from worth. We don't have to enter anything that we do trying to prove ourselves. We don't have to come in and exhausted and stressed. Oh God, it's Monday, not again. Oh God, it's whatever. We can enter fully with God's worth fully formed in us, where we may have a bad day, may get yelled at, may have a breakup, but God's sense of worth inside of us carries us through, and it doesn't get it down. Someone can say some really mean things to you, and there may be emotions to process, but ultimately, what are they going to do to you? The God of the universe has already said that you're valuable. The God of the universe sent his own son to die just for you, and that makes him valuable. That makes you valuable. And you're not valuable just because, God's loved the world, so you're lumped in. God loves each of us uniquely like we need to be loved. He loves us specifically for what we need. And his love is an active force that works in our lives. So as we close, I want us to think about that. I want us to think about where we are. I'm not going to call people forward, but I want you to think about the last week, the last month, and where are you getting your worth from? Where are you getting your confidence from? If you're in school, are you getting your worth from your grades, from your nice new kicks, from your clothes, from your social life? If those things are taken away, will you lose your worth? Are you gaining your worth from the company that you've built, from the position that you've scratched and clawed from the very bottom? Are you getting your worth from that? Are you getting your worth from your family? And those are all great things, but they're terrible sources of our intrinsic worth, because there's only one source of worth that's going to last. There's only one. It's the love of God. So if we don't have that, if that's not our source of worth, it'll be like a roller coaster, going up and going down. But if we do have that, it gives us a very new conception of reality. It makes us think about the world in a different way. Paul understood this. I mentioned earlier, he says, Christ's love compels us. And so not only was the love of God so full in Paul that it transformed his sense of worth, but it also changed the way Paul acted. It compelled him to act. compelled him to work, compelled him to do new things and think about life in a new way. And what did Paul do? Paul was a missionary. You think about God's love compelled him. Well, what did it compel him to do? Well, you read about what Paul talks about. He talks about his own testimony in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And he talks about all the times that he got beat up. He had stoned, which what stone means is they bury you up to your waist and throw big rocks at you till you die. And he was left for dead a number of times, not dead just from getting shot or stabbed. He was dead from getting beaten. Like most of the bones in his body had probably been broken, if not all of them. Constantly beaten, constantly on the run. There are many times where he writes, the Lord told me, do not be afraid. And you think about, why would the Lord say, do not be afraid, unless you're afraid? Yep. Paul was constantly on the run when he's on his missionary journeys. We get the highlights. We get the social media aspect of it. And you have one or two verses here. Yeah, and Paul got beaten and he got thrown in jail. It's not a big deal. But then, but you think about like those beatings, those jail times. They weren't quick things. They lasted days, sometimes weeks, maybe months. When he's finally put in jail for years, for 3 or 4 years. And he knew that people were trying to kill him. So you think about, he's not just in jail when he was skin raw and messed up, but he's waiting for the Jews to come and ambush him, the ungodly Jewish leaders. He's expecting them to come ambush him. And so every morning he wakes up, is this going to be the day? They try to come get me. They perform some trick, like, oh yeah, we're Paul's friends. We want to come talk to him. It's like, no, don't let them talk to me. Paul had all these things to be afraid of. He had all these things to be concerned about, but Christ's love inside of him compelled him further. And it didn't matter how many times he got beaten. It didn't matter how many times he went to jail. Christ's love was a foundation unshakable for him in his life. Why? Because he was rooted and firmly established in God's love. He got his sense of worth not on his physical body, because you know what? It probably had a whole lot of scars, a whole lot of broken bones. He got his sense of worth mainly from God. And it strengthened him, and it firmly established him as he went through all of that trauma. So if Sean would come up, we're going to take some time, and I want us to think about our lives. Think about where we are. Where's your self-worth? Where's your sense of worth coming from? Where's your sense of value coming from? And it works best if you're honest with yourself. And the easiest way is to look back. Well, how do I know the answer to that? Well, look back at the last couple of days. Maybe Thanksgiving was really good. Are you getting your sense of worth from family or from God? Maybe it's really bad. Are you getting your sense of worth from family or from God, or from work, or from whatever else? Consider where you are and where your worth is coming from, and it will change your life forever. It'll change the way you live, because you won't have to constantly prove yourself to people and prove yourself to work and prove yourself to this situation and prove yourself over here. You won't have to worry about that. People will say things about you. People may even beat you like they did Paul, but it'll keep you going. So Sean's going to sing. I encourage you to really look deep in your life. And if you don't know what to say or you don't know the thing, feel free to just sing along. But let's take stock. Let's take inventory for the next couple minutes.